Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to the Psychology of Bilingualism and Multilingualism. I am Dr. Ark Verma from the Department of Cognitive Sciences at IIT KANPUR. In this week, I am talking to you about the relationship of bilingualism and multilingualism with other cognitive functions. In the last couple of lectures, we talked about the relationship of bilingualism and multilingualism with different aspects of thought. In today's lecture, I want to talk about the relationship of bilingualism and multilingualism with intelligence. Now, so far we've basically reviewed studies from the perspective of linguistic relativity, wherein the focus was actually to investigate whether the peculiarities of languages known by a bilingual might actually influence their perceptual and thought processes about the world. However, there has also been a range of studies that have focused mainly on the effects of bilingualism on general cognitive abilities such as intelligence, memory, aspects of executive control, emotion, and so on. In the next set of lectures, I will actually focus on these aspects of the relationship between bilingualism and cognition. Now, studies actually looking to investigate the effects of bilingualism on general cognitive abilities do not necessarily need to have a very sophisticated understanding of the structure of languages involved. Rather, they seek to investigate the user of the languages and for the presence and absence of enhancement or detriment, say for example, in these specific abilities as a consequence of their bilingualism. You could say that somebody in your neighborhood is very smart because they know 4 or 5 or 6 different languages, or you could say that maybe because that person speaks 2 or 3 languages, that is where they are not very good in any of the languages they know. Also, people have always been curious about whether knowing more than one language makes you more intelligent, less intelligent, makes you communicatively more effective, not so effective, and so many different things. In this lecture, we're starting to look at this debate and see whether bilingualism actually has any measurable impact on any of these general cognitive functions that we're talking about. Typically, when you're looking at studies that want to do this, they are actually trying to compare a group of bilinguals with a carefully matched group of monolinguals on factors such as age, socioeconomic status, education, etc., parents, education and so on, in terms of, and then basically compare their performance in terms of a well-chosen task that would reveal a latent variable. See, for example, if you want to check somebody's concentration, if you want to check somebody's problem-solving capabilities, if you want to check somebody's abilities in terms of managing responses, selecting correct responses, and so on. So typically what people have been doing, or people would do, is that they would basically select a group of bilinguals, and they would select a group of matched monolinguals, which are not different in age, gender, socioeconomic status, and so many of these things. And then actually the only difference between these two groups will be that one of these groups is a bilingual and the other is a monolingual. And then both of these groups perform on a task, and you basically compare, any differences in their performances in the task actually can be zeroed in on the bilingualism of these different on these participants. So here, if you want to go ahead in this direction, task selection is actually of very special importance, because the same must be chosen on the basis of an informed hypothesis. You will not randomly pick a task. So there are many experimental tasks. People who are students of cognitive science or cognitive psychology would know that there are plenty of experimental tasks that are going around. And if you want to choose one of these tasks to compare the differences between bilinguals and monolinguals, you should have some kind of an informed intuition or an informed hypothesis about how bilinguals or monolinguals would perform on these tasks, and whether and what kind of differences there are to expect between these two, between the performances of bilinguals and monolinguals on these tasks. Say for example, you could take a test of vocabulary, and you would actually expect that, okay, because monolinguals are exposed to only one language, but probably they are exposed to this one language in great detail, they would have a much better vocabulary of this particular language, whereas because bilinguals are exposed to 2 or 3 languages, and they are probably, because of just the distribution of time and just the distribution of the amount of time they use these languages, they might not have as big a vocabulary in each of these languages as the monolingual speakers would have. So you can have any kind of question, and you, based on that question, you will select your task, and then you will compare the performance of bilinguals and monolinguals. More recently, what has also been happening is that people have been basically just picking up bilinguals, a range of bilinguals, and basically comparing the performance of different types of bilinguals, or on different types of bilinguals by virtue of their degree of proficiency in the second language, age of acquisition of second language, early or simultaneous bilingual. We have talked about all of these differences so far. You can actually compare within bilinguals also how they perform on a given task, and if you have a informed hypothesis, it would tell you basically that, okay, what kind of difference to expect, and later how would you try to explain these differences. Let's take an example. As I was saying, researchers could hypothesize that due to a vaster conceptual world of bilinguals as compared to monolinguals, they would possess a relatively higher skill in divergent thinking, because bilinguals are exposed to concepts from 2 different languages, maybe sometimes 3 or 4 different languages. They would probably be able to think divergently more as compared to monolinguals. Or the hypothesis that because of their practice with managing their 2 co-activated languages, bilinguals may possess superior abilities of cognitive control as compared to monolinguals. So you can have any of these hypotheses, you can choose a task which is testing for these specific abilities, and then you could compare the performance of bilinguals and monolinguals on these tasks. Now, interestingly, given the structure of the 2 languages of a bilingual is not really a concern here, the bilinguals knowing any pair of languages could actually be recruited in these experiments. Although the effects of these tasks on cognition may actually vary depending upon the typological differences between the 2 known languages of a bilingual. For instance, the ability of divergent thinking in bilinguals may be more if the bilinguals have learned 2 distant languages. Say for example, a Hindi-English bilingual may be known to have a bit more ability in terms of divergent thinking as compared to a Dutch-English bilingual or a Spanish-Catalan bilingual for that matter. The same may apply for any kind of ability that you are actually intending to test. Additionally, to sort of ensure that the participants are actually well matched, the experimenters collected information about a number of background variables, such as the children's and their parents' attitudes towards learning French or English, in their academic performance in school, their ages, gender, socioeconomic status, degree of education, and so many other things. Now, the authors initially had hypothesized, based on the contemporary literature that had been collecting so far, that bilingualism would actually be detrimental to their performance on these tasks of intelligence. However, in contrast to their expectations, the bilingual children actually outperformed significantly the monolingual children on the majority of tests and subtests, both in verbal and non-verbal intelligence. More precisely, the bilingual children were found to be better in concept formation and in tasks that required mental flexibility, and also they showed a more diversified set of mental abilities than the monolingual controlled children. Interestingly, these results were actually very robust and stable and did not change when the differences between the 2 groups were matched specifically for socioeconomic class, age, gender, etc. And again, these results did come as a surprise for the investigators, as they were rather contrary to the contemporary literature and consequent intuitions. However, the authors later observed that some of the earlier studies which had not found these differences may have lacked some degree of experimental rigor and had not really controlled for various variables such as age, gender, socioeconomic status, amount of education, etc., which may have been the reason why they were not finding these differences so far. However, it is also discussed that some of the early studies were not really standardized, and sometimes the bilingual children were tested in their weaker language, and hence leading to lower scores on these tests. Say for example, if you are testing testing a bilingual who's just picking up his second language, say for example somebody who's just learning English and has only spoken or performed in Hindi for, let's say, till their high school or till their senior secondary. Now if you start testing these people directly in English and they have little or less knowledge of English, obviously they will score less in these tests, because these tests are in English. And you see that in our country also, a lot of exams are actually provide bilingual alternatives, so that we can actually handle the confound of language as a barrier to their overall intelligence. Now, while researchers actually reasoned about the reasons for earlier studies not finding any beneficial effects on bilingualism, some actually wondered about the unique points of this study by Peel and Lambert, and why this study would have been able to find the differences between bilinguals and monolinguals. One of the things that was noted, that it could be that the Montreal region of Canada, where the participants in the study were actually selected from, both English and French were socially highly valued, and they were respected languages. And therefore, the acquisition of English by French-speaking children of this region was not really seen as a threat on their learning French, and basically it was no social pressure was not there to pick up this language. So in a sense, these children were happily learning English, and they were not really threatened by it, or there was no social pressure to learn or to not learn English. So in fact, learning English did not really put them into danger of losing their French, and rather added to their linguistic repertoire with a new language and with exposure to a new conceptual world at the same time. So this basically can be referred to as a form of bilingualism that adds to a bilingual's overall linguistic repertoire, and the existing language does not suffer a cost at all. This was referred to as additive bilingualism by Peel and Lambert. Now, an opposite scenario is also possible. An opposite scenario could have been referred to as subtractive bilingualism, wherein basically the bilingual would feel forced to put aside their own native language or subtract from their knowledge of the ethnic languages for a more prestigious and necessary national language. Say for example, if they were forced to learn English and leave out French, it would sort of harm them in their general cognitive functioning. Here, the new learned L2 could be generally, gradually expected to replace the L1, which would weaken the native language and therefore have detrimental effects for general cognitive functioning, as neither of the two languages would now be seen as a natural tool for the expression of thought and any kinds of their feelings. Now, this is very similar to what you can see is being talked about in the country now, that we are trying to give chance to people to learn in their native languages. It is very important for individuals to learn in their native language so that they can grasp better, they can understand better, and there is no burden of learning English before they can grasp more sophisticated concepts. Finally, the authors also reasoned that the children in Peel and Lambert's study actually performed better than monolinguals because they had this they actually could utilize the opportunities available to them for becoming these additive bilinguals. Now, alternatively, another possible reason for Peel and Lambert's findings could also be that the relationship between bilingualism and intelligence could be the other way around. Now, some researchers actually wondered that maybe it is not that bilingualism is helping these children become more intelligent, it is because they are already intelligent, they are being able to become bilingual and utilize the opportunities of learning the two languages, and because they are already intelligent, they would anyway score better on the tests of intelligence that they were tested upon. Now, this is an interesting proposal, but actually the best way to do this, or to determine the causality of the relationship between bilingualism and intelligence, one would actually need to design a study, maybe a longitudinal study, where two matched groups, where in one group you would actually have the experimental treatment, let's say give the opportunity to these kids to become bilingual, and in the other this opportunity would not be present. On all other respects, these two groups should be completely matched. And actually, there was a bunch of longitudinal studies that actually suggest that bilingualism did improve general cognitive functioning to a certain extent. Let's look at a study like that. For instance, Scott in 1973 compared two groups of English Canadian children. At the start of the study, the children from one group, which was the experimental group, were actually given the opportunity to become bilingual through immersion schooling in French over a couple of years, whereas children from the other group, which was the control group, were actually not given this opportunity and were schooled exclusively in English. Now, the children from both these groups were actually matched on IQ and other socioeconomic status in the beginning of the study already. In another study, a random selection of schools in an area of New Guinea, which is a French-speaking locale in America, were permitted to offer part of their elementary curriculum in French, which was the children's home language. And another group of schools with children of similar intelligence and socioeconomic backgrounds was actually not allowed to do this, and they offered an all English curriculum. So you can see one group of schools is allowing the bilingual exposure to these kids, whereas the other group of school is not allowing bilingual exposure to these kids, and both groups are actually matched. Now, when children in these two studies were tested after a gap of few years, children from both these studies actually outperformed the other monolingual group that on tests that tested for the aspects of cognitive functioning such as math or divergent thinking. So you can see that in some sense bilingualism, all things considered, is actually helping these kids become better. Finally, in a third longitudinal study, which was conducted by Kessler and Quinn in 1980, a group of Hispanic American English children, Hispanic American children, were provided with the opportunity to learn subject matter in their home language, and which was Spanish, and their performance on a number of tasks was actually compared to that of a socioeconomically more privileged group of middle-class monolingual English-speaking white children. Now, interestingly, both groups of children were given extensive training program in science, inquiry, through discussions, films, and hypothesis testing. Now, not surprisingly, as we've been seeing in the study so far, the students from the Hispanic American group actually outperformed those in the English American group in problem-solving capabilities, generating hypotheses of a higher complexity, and even generating those hypotheses in a better quality of linguistic structure than their English counterparts. If you look at all of these studies in totality, you would realize that these results actually suggest that bilingualism does have some positive impact on cognitive functioning, and that it is useful to allow ethnic minority children to nurture their home language and thus to convert their experiences from subtractive bilingualism into additive bilingualism. Now, interestingly, while we've been talking about the benefits of bilingualism, we've been talking about how it can help people's intelligence and so on. There are also a range of studies that have, have pointed out certain drawbacks in being bilingual. For instance, researchers have actually shown that as compared to monolingual norms, bilingual children actually have relatively smaller vocabularies in their separate languages. It's probably because as bilinguals have two fully developed lexicons, and two words for the same concept, each single word gets used much less often than a single word that a monolingual uses, and therefore is susceptible to loss and forgetting, and overall being lower in the frequency. Now, this is also one of the reasons that word retrieval is in fact slower and more effortful in bilinguals compared to monolinguals. So this also sort of supports this notion that yes, bilinguals typically will have lower vocabulary in each of their two languages as opposed to monolingual speakers of both their languages. Interestingly, bilingualism has also been linked to advantages in metalinguistic awareness. For example, the ability to reflect on and manipulate the structural features of language independent of meaning. Now, metalinguistic awareness is basically where you're not really just caught in the meanings of individual words, but whatever overall sense you're getting. And researchers have actually suggested that metalinguistic awareness is actually increased in bilinguals because of their dual linguistic environment. They are having exposure to two very different, sometimes very diagonally opposite conceptual worlds, which actually enables them to appreciate or pay special attention to the structural aspects of both their languages. In other words, because they have two fully developed linguistic systems, it affords them a chance to analyze and compare the two and hence gain more insights about both of these linguistic systems. Now, for instance, one of the examples of the said metalinguistic awareness has actually been the observation that bilinguals have greater word awareness than monolinguals and have the knowledge of the word's form and meaning, and have the knowledge that words form and meaning are not actually entirely inseparable entities. They sort of already get the sense that these two things are arbitrarily related. How would this happen? Say, for example, I am a Hindi-English bilingual. I know that there is a word sebe for this particular fruit and there is a word apple for this particular fruit. I would know that both sebe and apple do not have anything to do with the fruit itself. They are just two different ways of calling out this particular concept. And this realization would make me sort of ponder about, how, these two words are related to the object, and what are the different meanings that can be implied, and so on. This works even better when you're talking about more abstract entities rather than concrete nouns. Now, in order to generate or gain empirical support for these observations from Leopold, Janko Worrell actually hypothesized that the early separation of word sound and word meaning might actually cause a degree of accelerated semantic development in bilingual children as compared to monolingual children. Now, the underlying assumption here was that attention to form aspects is a developmentally earlier stage than attention to meaning aspects. And bilingual children would actually be able to do this much earlier than monolingual children, because for them there is, these two things are much more tightly knitted. Now, Janko Worrell tested for these hypotheses while in a semantic phonetic preference test in which Afrikaans English and monolingual English and Afrikaans children, so again there are three groups, were actually presented with a set of standard words, each accompanied by two choice words. One of the latter two words was similar, in sound to the standard. Say, for example, cap and can are very similar in sound, and the other was semantically related to the standard word. Say, for example, cap and hat. Now, cap and hat are semantically related, whereas cap and can are phonetically related. Now, the participants in this study were actually asked to select the choice word most similar to the standard. So, they were asked questions like, I have three words, cap, can, and hat. Which is more like cap, can, or hat? Now, if the children are actually going for semantic relatedness, they would actually go by cap and hat. And if they are actually going just by the cosmetic property of phonology, they would probably say cap and can are more similar to each other. Now, all of these participants were young children aged between 4 and 6 and 7 to 9 years, and they were tested in both their languages, and their performance in Afrikaans and English was compared with the performance of that of African English bilinguals respectively. Now, in this, as far as results are concerned, the authors actually predicted that the older children would select the semantically related alternative much more often than the younger children, and that within each group, bilingual children would select the semantically related alternative much more often than the monolingual controls. Indeed, the results actually showed that semantic preference did increase with age. So basically, we are seeing that with age, children are getting this awareness of semantics and conceptual relatedness between objects. But this age function actually was there only in monolinguals. In bilinguals, they did not see this age function because the bilinguals had actually achieved this stage much earlier in life. So with change, say for example, between 4 to 6 years and 7 to 9 years, there was no difference in age because both of these groups are already performing at a ceiling, which tells us again in turn that bilinguals are indeed better in their metalinguistic awareness as compared to their monolingual counterparts. Moving on, in another experiment, the authors actually gathered evidence that the accelerated semantic development of the bilinguals was related to their early awareness of the relationship between word form and word reference is arbitrary. Now herein, children were asked 3 types of questions. We are still talking about the Yanko oral study. It's just another follow-up experiment that they're doing. In this study, they're actually asking 3 types of questions. Say, for example, why is a dog called a dog? And these questions called for a judgment of whether or not the word names could be interchanged. Say, for example, could you call a dog cow and a cow dog? And questions that call for interchange of word names in place. Say, for example, let us play a game. Let us call a dog cow. Now, does this cow have horns? Does this cow give milk? Now, if you see that if the children will have this awareness of the fact that the animal and the name cow or the animal and the name dog attached to it are actually different things, and they are not really related. The cow word does not have anything to do with the cow, and the dog word does not have anything to do with the dog animal, then they would very easily be able to change these things. Say, for example, if they are asked to exchange the names, they would still be able to do that while appreciating at the same time that even if you call the cow dog, it would still have horns, it will still give milk, and if you call the dog cow, it would still bark. Now, this is something sort of interesting, and it basically explicitly tests the children on their knowledge of whether these relationships are arbitrary or not. And again, just to sort of remind you, the realization that this relationship is arbitrary would come much more naturally and earlier to bilinguals, because they have 2 systems, 2 words to map on a single concept, as compared to monolinguals who had 1 concept mapped onto 1 word and would think that this relationship is rather intricate. Now, in this experiment, again, the bilingual children outperformed the monolingual controls on the second type of questions, when you were asking to interchange them. And the performance of both groups on the questions of the remaining types was rather similar. Now, in the backdrop of what we have been discussing, if you look at this based on the differential result of bilinguals on the second type of questions, the authors actually concluded, and it made sense, that bilingual children are actually aware of the arbitrary relationship between a word and its meaning at a much younger age than a monolingual child. So it tells us that this metalinguistic awareness is also benefited, or is something that the bilingual children are sort of endowed with, or they grasp it at a very early age, which may augur very well for other kinds of cognitive functions which these bilingual kids would actually engage in. This is all that I wanted to talk to you about in today's lecture, and I'll see you on the other side with a different lecture. Thank you.